My son said it the way he might announce a business decision flatly, without looking up from his phone. "This house is mine now. Dad, it's time you understood that." Helen set down her fork. The sound of it against the ceramic plate was the loudest thing in the room for a moment. What Marcus didn't know was that I had already called Patricia Chen at 7 that morning. He was announcing something I had already set in motion. I had made pot roast that evening, the same recipe Carol used for 31 years. The one where you add half a cup of beef broth in the last hour and let it sit with the lid off. The cornbread was still warm. I had set the table the way I always do cloth napkins, the blue placemats Helen picked out in October, water glasses filled before anyone sat down. Marcus had come in from the city 40 minutes late without mentioning it. He'd barely looked at the food. I didn't answer right away. I've learned that silence makes people say things they wouldn't otherwise say. Marcus said 2 more sentences, something about market value, something about equity before I responded. Both were useful. I finished the last of my pot roast. I blotted my mouth with the napkin, folded it once along the crease, and set it beside the plate. Then I stood up. Helen was watching me. Not Marcus Helen. She had the particular stillness of a woman who already understood what was about to happen and was deciding whether to be afraid of it. I said, "All right." That was everything I said. I walked into the kitchen. I could hear Marcus behind me, resuming his explanation to the room. I ran a water over my hands at the sink, dried them on the dish towel, and picked up my phone. I found Patricia Chen's number. She'd been my realtor for 11 years, the one who'd sold the Milwaukee property in 2019 and never once overcharged me on commission. I pressed call. She answered on the second ring. I said, "Patricia, it's time. List it tomorrow morning." She didn't ask why. She said, "I've been waiting for this call. Walter." I hung up and walked back into the dining room. Marcus was still talking. He stopped when I sat down. I lifted my water glass, drank, and set it back on the blue placemat. "You should start packing your things. Marcus," I said, "the house goes on market at 8 a.m. tomorrow." I built this house in 1989. That sentence sounds simple when I say it now, but it doesn't carry the full weight of what it means. I was 32 years old, with a civil engineering degree from Oregon State and enough savings to buy the lot outright, 3/4 of an acre, on a gentle slope that caught the morning light from the east. I drafted the plans myself at the kitchen table of our apartment on S.E. Hawthorne, working nights after Carol went to sleep, using a T-square and a mechanical pencil I still have in the drawer of my desk. We broke ground in March. Carol came to the site on the second day of the foundation pour and stayed until dark, sitting on an overturned bucket with a paperback, her thumb holding the page flat against the wind. Marcus was 2 years old. By August, when the framing was up and the roof decking was in, he had learned to say the word house. He said it pointing at the skeleton of beams and joists, his finger extended, his face certain. We moved in that October. The years in that house are not a sequence of events I can list. They are a texture, the particular creak of the third stair, the way the afternoon light moved across the kitchen floor between 3 and 4 o'clock, the same path every day, season after season, 35 years of that light. I know every inch of that house the way a man knows his own hands, not because I've thought about it, but because I've never had to. I was 32 years old. I had a civil engineering degree from Oregon State, 4 years of field experience with a Portland infrastructure firm, and enough savings to buy the lot outright on the edge of Beaverton, 3/4 of an acre on a gentle slope that caught the morning light from the east. I drafted the plans myself at the kitchen table of our apartment on S.E. Hawthorne, working nights after Carol went to sleep, using the same drafting tools I'd carried since graduate school, a T-square, a set of French curves. A mechanical pencil I still have in the drawer of my desk. Carol was 30 years old that summer. She was working the overnight shift at Providence St. Vincent 3 nights a week and studying for her nursing certification the other 4. She didn't complain. She brought me coffee at midnight when she saw my light on, set the mug down without a word, and went to bed. That was Carol. Presence without noise. She understood that the house wasn't vanity. It was the only thing I could build that would still be standing after I was gone. We broke ground in March. I hired 2 framers brothers named Dale and Roy Hutchins from Tigard, and a plumber named Gene who had worked with my firm on a drainage project the previous year. Everything else I did myself or with Carol on weekends. The foundation pour took 3 days. I was there for all of it, watching the concrete settle, checking the level every hour. Carol brought sandwiches on the second day and stayed until dark, sitting on an overturned bucket, reading a paperback with her thumb holding the page flat against the wind. Marcus was 2 years old. We set up a playpen near the edge of the site on the days we couldn't find a sitter, and he sat in it contentedly, picking up wood shavings and examining them with the seriousness of a man who had important work to do. By May, he had collected enough sawdust in his pockets that Carol started finding it in the washing machine. She stopped complaining about it somewhere around June. By August, when the framing was up and the roof decking was in, he had learned to say the word house. He said it pointing at the skeleton of beams and joists, his finger extended, his face certain. We moved in that October. The master bedroom wasn't finished. We slept on a mattress on the floor for 6 weeks while I tiled the bathroom, but the kitchen worked, the furnace worked, and the front door closed flush on the first try. I remember standing in the empty living room the night we moved in, looking at the walls I had framed, the ceiling I had measured 4 times before, nailing, and feeling something that wasn't pride exactly. It was closer to recognition. This is the place. This is where it happens. Carol painted the walls herself the following spring. She chose a color called antique linen for the living room and a pale sage green for the kitchen that she found in a sample book at the hardware store on Canyon Road. She was precise about it. 2 coats, a clean edge at every corner, no roller marks. When she finished the kitchen, she stood in the center of the room and turned slowly, looking at every wall. Then she said, "Now it's ours." I didn't say anything. I didn't need to. We raised 2 children in that house, Marcus first, then Margaret 3 years later. Margaret was born in December 1991, and Carol brought her home to a room we'd painted yellow, Carol's choice again. She painted it herself, 7 months pregnant, on a stepladder while I stood at the bottom with my hand on the rail. I told her to let me finish it. She said she wanted to do it herself. That was also Carol. The years in that house are not a sequence of events I can list. They are a texture, the sound of the back door in summer, the particular creak of the 3rd stair, the way the afternoon light moved across the kitchen floor between 3 and 4 o'clock, the same path every day, season after season. 35 years of that light. I know every inch of that house the way a man knows his own hands, not because I've thought about it, but because I've never had to. Carol got her diagnosis in the spring of 2019, ovarian cancer, stage 3. The oncologist at OHSU was a careful woman named Dr. Fenton who explained everything clearly and without softening it. Carol listened to all of it, asked 2 questions, and then asked if we could go home. We drove back on the Sunset Highway without speaking. When we pulled into the driveway, she looked at the house for a moment. The white trim I'd repainted the previous fall, the rhododendron she'd planted in 2003 that had grown to cover the lower half of the east window, and she said, "I want to stay here," I said. "Then that's where we'll be." The next 18 months I cooked every morning. Not elaborate meals, oatmeal with sliced banana, scrambled eggs with toast, the soft foods she could manage when the nausea was bad. I brought the tray to the master bedroom, set it on the nightstand, and sat with her while she ate. Some mornings she ate everything. Some mornings she managed 3 bites and pushed the tray away. Either way, I sat there. Every evening I read to her. We worked through all of Marilyn Robinson, then Patrick O'Brien, then a long biography of Eisenhower that Carol said she'd always meant to read. She fell asleep most nights before I finished the chapter. I kept reading anyway, quietly, until I was sure she was out. Marcus visited 4 times in those 18 months. Margaret came every 3 weeks, drove the 2 hours from her place in Eugene without being asked, brought food, sat with her mother, did the laundry without announcing it. Marcus called occasionally. He was busy. He said, "The market was moving fast." I told him I understood. Carol died in February 2020. She died in the master bedroom, in the bed we'd shared for 31 years, on a Tuesday morning when the light was coming in through the east window. I was holding her hand. Margaret was in the chair by the window. Marcus was not there. He'd said he would come that weekend. I have lived alone in this house for 5 years since then. Helen came into my life 2 years after Carol, introduced by a mutual friend at a church potluck. She was a retired nurse herself, practical and direct, with a dry sense of humor that caught me off guard the first time she used it. We married quietly 18 months ago. Helen understood from the beginning what this house was. She never asked me to change anything Carol had chosen. She added her own things slowly, carefully, the way you add to something that already exists rather than replacing it. That is the only kind of person I could have shared this house with. Helen was the one who told me about Marcus's plan. She'd overheard a phone call in November and Marcus had come for Thanksgiving, and he'd stepped out to the back porch thinking she was in the kitchen. She heard enough. She came to find me in the garage where I was cleaning a drill press, and she stood in the doorway and told me what she'd heard, quietly, without editorializing. When she finished, I set the cleaning cloth down on the workbench. "He said the property is worth too much to sit on," Helen said. "He said he has a buyer lined up." I looked at the wall of the garage, the pegboard I'd installed in 1994 with every tool in its outlined place. The same pegboard Marcus had helped me put up on a Saturday afternoon when he was 7 years old. He'd held the nails while I drove them. "Let him try," I said. "I'm ready." Helen looked at me for a moment. She knew what that meant, or she knew enough of it. She went back inside. I picked up the cleaning cloth and finished the drill press, and then I sat at the workbench for a while in the quiet of the garage, with the smell of oil and sawdust and the particular cold of a Pacific Northwest November coming in under the door. I had been ready for longer than she knew. I had made my first call to Frank Delgado, my attorney of 14 years, the previous September, 3 months before Helen overheard anything. When Marcus had come by on a Sunday afternoon with Vanessa and spent 45 minutes explaining why a man my age would be happier in a smaller place, somewhere with less maintenance, he'd said, somewhere easier to manage. He'd had listings pulled up on his phone. He'd shown me square footage and HOA fees in proximity to medical facilities, as if the consideration of medical facilities was the thing that would move me. I had listened to all of it. I had not said much. When he finished, I told him I'd think about it, and I walked him and Vanessa to the door, and I stood on the front porch and watched his car back down the driveway. Then I went inside and called Frank. That was 14 months ago. By the time Marcus sat at my dinner table and announced that this house was his now, I had been ready for over a year. I called Patricia Chen at 7:43 in the morning, before Marcus would have been out of bed. She picked up on the second ring. I had her number memorized the way I had memorized load calculations and soil-bearing capacities, not because I wrote it down repeatedly, but because I had used it enough times that it had simply become part of how I thought. I told her what I expected to happen that evening. I told her Marcus would likely make his move at dinner. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Are you sure?" I said, "I've been sure for 6 months." She said she would have everything ready. She said she would call Frank Delgado, my attorney, to confirm the filing window. I told her I appreciated that. She said, "Walter, after 11 years, you don't have to thank me." I told her I knew, and I meant it. I set the phone on the kitchen counter and stood at the window for a moment. The backyard was the same as it had been in October, in September, in every month I could remember. The Douglas fir at the southeast corner had grown another 3 or 4 inches. Since spring, I had planted it the year Marcus started middle school, a $15 seedling from a nursery on Barber Boulevard that Carol had picked out because she liked the way the label described its eventual height. Majestic, the label said. She had read it out loud twice and laughed. I turned from the window and started on the brisket. Carol had a particular way she liked it low heat. A full 4 hours. The braising liquid built from beef stock and 2 tablespoons of apple cider vinegar and a bay leaf she always said I used too many of, and I always ignored her on. I used 3. The cornbread went in at 3:15, when the brisket was already settled into its low simmer and the kitchen had taken on that specific weight of slow-cooked meat and wood smoke from the oven's old heating element that had never been fully right since 2019, but that I had never replaced because Carol said it gave the cornbread character. These were her dishes. Not in the sense that she had invented them, they were ordinary enough, but in the sense that they were the meals she had asked for on the days she was too tired to ask for much. The last 2 winters of her illness, when she spent most of her time in the back bedroom with the window cracked because she said the cold air helped, I had made brisket and cornbread on the days she felt well enough to eat at the table. She would come down the hallway in her robe, holding the wall, and she would sit in the chair closest to the kitchen and tell me the cornbread smelled right before she had even seen it. I was not a sentimental man by training or by preference. 31 years as a civil engineer had given me a particular relationship with permanence. You build things correctly or you build them to fail, and sentiment has no load-bearing capacity. But I knew, standing at that stove with the brisket beginning to pull apart at the edges the way it did when the timing was right, that this was the last time I would cook these dishes in this kitchen. That knowledge sat in me the way a structural calculation sits not as grief, exactly, but as a fact with weight and dimension, something that had to be accounted for before you could move forward. Helen came through the back door at 4:15, still in her scrubs, her hospital badge clipped to her collar. She had worked a 12-hour shift at Providence, and she moved the way she always moved after a long shift carefully, as if she was conserving something. She set her bag on the bench by the door and looked at the stove, at the dishes on the counter, at the table I had already begun to set. She did not say anything for a moment. She looked at the plates, the cream-colored ones with the narrow blue border that Carol had chosen at a shop in Lake Oswego 30 years ago. The ones we had used for every significant dinner in this house since. Carol had said they were practical, and Carol had meant elegant, and she had been right on both counts. Helen crossed the kitchen and stood beside me. She put her hand over mine where it rested on the counter. She held it there for a few seconds, not squeezing, just present, and then she let go and went to wash up. Marcus called at 4:47. He said he and Vanessa would be there around 6. He said it like a confirmation, not a question. I told him to come at 6. I told him I had something special on the stove. He laughed a little. He said, "Good. We need to talk about the house anyway." I said, "I know." There was a brief pause. He may have expected me to say something else. I did not. I set the phone down and went back to the cornbread, which needed another 12 minutes. I adjusted the oven by 5 degrees. I took the cream-colored plates from the cabinet and set them on the table, 2 on one side, 2 on the other, the same arrangement Carol had always preferred. I put out the good forks. I folded the napkins the way she had shown me, which I had never done correctly until the 3rd year of our marriage, and which I had done correctly ever since. The house smelled like brisket and cornbread and the faint cedar of the walls, which was always strongest in the evening when the temperature dropped outside and the house held its warmth in. I sat down at the table for a moment, in my chair, with the kitchen behind me and the front window ahead. The light was going. The Douglas fir at the corner of the yard was a dark shape against the sky. I had built this house in the spring of 1989 before Marcus was born, before Margaret was born, when Carol and I were 32 years old and certain of very little except each other and the load calculations I had drawn by hand on drafting paper that I still had somewhere in the filing cabinet in the study. I had built it to last. I had built every joint and every beam and every footing to last longer than I would need it to. I stood up, straightened my chair, and went to check on the brisket. Marcus arrived at 6:14. I heard his car in the driveway, a leased BMW, 3 years old, silver, before I saw the headlights sweep across the kitchen window. Helen was in the living room, reading. She set her book face down on the side table and looked at me. I didn't say anything. I went back to the stove and turned the heat under the green beans to low. The front door opened without a knock. Marcus had stopped knocking sometime in the last 2 years. I wasn't sure exactly when it had stopped, only that it had. Vanessa came in first. She was wearing a dark coat and heeled boots that clicked on the hardwood in the entryway. She stopped in the doorway and looked at the photograph of Carol and me at the Columbia River Gorge, the one that had hung there for 22 years, and said, "That's a beautiful photo. Mr. Brennan, she looks so happy there." Her voice was warm, genuine, even. I looked at her for a moment and said, "Thank you." Marcus had told me once that Vanessa had lost her own mother young, and I had believed, in that moment, that the warmth was real. I'm still not entirely certain it wasn't. Then she stepped into the hallway, and her eyes moved past the coat hooks, past the mat, past the photograph she had just admired, and she didn't look at the ceiling. She looked at the width of the hallway, the height of the door frame into the living room, the built-in bookshelves I had framed and fitted myself in the winter of 1993. Her eyes moved the way I had seen appraisers' eyes move, not taking in a house, but taking inventory of one. She looked at the ceiling. Then she turned and looked at the width of the hallway, the height of the door frame into the living room, the built-in bookshelves I had framed and fitted myself in the winter of 1993. Her eyes moved the way I had seen appraisers' eyes move, not taking in a house, but taking inventory of one. Marcus followed her in. He put his keys on the entryway table without looking at it. The way you set something down in a place you already consider yours. He said, "Hey, Dad," in the direction of the kitchen, and that was all. He didn't come in. He stood in the living room doorway and watched Vanessa cross to the far window, the one that looks out over the backyard and the Douglas fir. She put one hand on the window frame and looked out. Marcus smiled at something I couldn't read. Helen said, "Dinner's ready when you are." Her voice was even. She had picked her book back up, but she wasn't reading it. We sat down at 6:30. I had set the table the way Carol used to cloth napkins, the good plates, the water glasses that had been a wedding gift from Carol's mother and that we had never broken a single one of in 37 years of marriage. Vanessa looked at the table without sitting down for a moment, and I thought she was going to say something about the plates. She didn't. She pulled out her chair and sat. The brisket was good. I knew it was good because I had been making it the same way since 1991, and I knew exactly what it was supposed to taste like. Marcus took a small portion and ate 3 bites in the first 10 minutes. He was talking about a listing he had closed in Lake Oswego, a 4-bedroom colonial, $2.3 million, the highest per square foot sale in that zip code this year. He said it twice, the per square foot figure, and both times he looked at Vanessa when he said it, not at me. Vanessa nodded and refilled her water glass. She had not touched the green beans. Helen ate. She didn't speak. She cut her brisket into small pieces the way she always did and ate steadily and watched Marcus's face with the particular attention of a woman who has spent 30 years reading vital signs. Vanessa set down her fork and looked around the dining room. She looked at the crown molding, at the window proportions, at the built-in china cabinet that I had designed to hold Carol's grandmother's dishes, and that still held them. She said, "This is a nice house. Good bones." She paused, "But it's wasted on one person." Marcus nodded once. He was still looking at his plate, but he was nodding in the way people nod when they've heard something said before and agree with it. I put a piece of brisket in my mouth and chewed it. The meat had rested properly. The bark was right. I swallowed and reached for my water. The conversation moved. Marcus talked about interest rates, about inventory shortages in the Portland metro market, about a development project east of Gresham that he said was going to change the whole corridor. Vanessa said something about staging. I listened and ate. Helen refilled the green beans. Outside, a car passed on Ridgecrest Lane and its headlights moved briefly across the ceiling. Marcus pushed his plate back slightly and picked up his water glass. He held it with both hands and looked at me across the table with an expression I recognized, the expression of a man who has rehearsed something and is deciding whether the moment is right. I had seen that expression on the faces of contractors who wanted to renegotiate mid-project. I had learned, over 40 years of civil engineering, that the best response to that expression was to continue eating and say nothing. He said, "Dad, we need to talk about the future." He set the glass down. "This house is too big for you. Vanessa and I have been thinking about it, and we think you should move to a smaller place, something more manageable. We'll take over the mortgage and the property." I set my fork down. I looked at him. I said, "I see." Then I picked my fork back up. Marcus waited. When I didn't continue, he glanced at Vanessa. She was watching me with the same steady, appraising look she had used on the window frame and the china cabinet. Helen had stopped eating. Her hands were in her lap. Marcus straightened in his chair. Something shifted in his face, a small recalibration. The way a salesman adjusts when the first offer doesn't land. He said, "Actually, Dad." He said it more slowly this time, the way you say something to someone you've decided isn't listening carefully enough. "This house is mine now. It's time you understood that. You're old. You need to let go." The dining room was quiet. The refrigerator ran in the kitchen. Somewhere outside, the Douglas fir moved in a light wind off the valley. I finished the last piece of brisket on my plate. I set my fork across the plate the way Carol had taught me, tines down, the way her mother had taught her. I picked up my napkin and touched the corners of my mouth. I folded the napkin and put it beside the plate. Helen was looking at Marcus, not with anger, with something quieter and more final than anger. Marcus was still watching me, waiting for something, a protest, an argument, tears, the particular helplessness of an old man who has just been told the shape of his remaining years. Vanessa had her hands folded on the table. I stood up and began clearing the plates. Marcus said, "That's it. You're just going to clear the plates." I set the stack near the sink. I turned around. "All right, Marcus," I said, "I understand." He stared at me. He had prepared for anger. He had prepared for tears, for the lowered voice of a man who has run out of options, for the particular desperation that looks like dignity from a distance but isn't. He had not prepared for this. "That's it," he said again. "You're not going to fight." "No," I said, "I'm not." I walked to the counter where I had left my jacket folded over the back stool. My phone was in the inside pocket. Helen had followed me into the kitchen. She stood near the doorway, her arms at her sides, watching me. She had the stillness of someone who has already made her peace with a decision and is simply waiting to see it executed. She said quietly, "Are you doing it?" "Yes," I said, "now." I found Patricia's number and pressed call. It rang twice. "Walter." Her voice was even. Patricia Chen had been a licensed realtor in the Portland metro area for 23 years. We had worked together on 4 transactions, the first of them 11 years ago, when I had sold a rental property on Glencoe Road. She knew how I moved, and I knew how she worked. Neither of us wasted the other's time. "Patricia," I said, "it's time. List the house at 8 a.m. Full asking price. No negotiation." There was a brief pause, not hesitation, something else. Then she said, "Already prepared the listing. I've been waiting for this call. The paperwork is ready. I'll file it in the morning." I said, "Thank you." I ended the call and put the phone back in my pocket. Helen was still standing in the doorway. She didn't say anything. There was nothing that needed saying. I walked back into the dining room. Marcus was leaning toward Vanessa, speaking in a low voice, his shoulders already relaxing. He had interpreted my silence as surrender, my calm as concession. He looked up when I came back in, and there was something almost magnanimous in his expression, the look of a man who has won and is deciding how generous to be about it. I pulled my chair out and stood behind it. "Marcus," I said, "I'm listing this house tomorrow morning. Full price. You need to start packing your things." The color left his face the way heat leaves a room when a door opens in winter, not all at once in stages, from the jaw upward. Vanessa put her hand flat on the table. Marcus said, "You can't," and then stopped, because he had started the sentence before he knew how to finish it. I said, "The realtor is filing the paperwork at 8. Patricia Chen, if you need the name. She's been expecting this call for 2 weeks. Marcus stood up. His chair scraped the floor. "Dad?" "You asked me tonight if this house was yours." I said, "I heard you. I thought about it while I finished my dinner. The answer is no. It has never been yours. And as of tomorrow morning, it won't be mine either." I picked up my water glass from the table and carried it toward the kitchen. At the doorway, I stopped. "Get some sleep," I said. "You'll need to make some calls tomorrow." I went upstairs. The third step still creaked in the same place it had always creaked, the way it had since Marcus was 9 years old and I had known. Every night, exactly when he was coming home. I had built this house to last. I had built it knowing every sound it made. I walked down the hall to the small room at the back, the one I had been using since Helen arrived, and I sat on the edge of the bed in the dark for a moment before I turned on the lamp. Downstairs, I could hear Marcus's voice, low and urgent, then Vanessa's, then silence. I had expected to feel something large. I didn't. I felt the particular quiet of a man who has made a decision he should have made earlier, and who is no longer spending energy on the distance between where he is and where he should be. I turned off the lamp. Outside, the Douglas fir moved in the same light wind it had always moved in. Marcus came upstairs at 10:15. I heard his footsteps on the third stair, the one that had always creaked slightly to the right, the one I had never repaired because Carol said it sounded like the house breathing. He knocked twice on the door of the small room. I opened it. He was still in his dinner clothes. His tie was loosened. He said, "Dad, you can't do this. This is my house." His voice was controlled, but only just. "I'm trying to help you. You're 67 years old, and you're living in a place that's too big for one person, and I'm offering you a way to—" I said, "No, it's not. It's mine. I built it." I kept my voice at the same level I would use to read a measurement off a site plan. "And I'm selling it." He stared at me for a moment. Then he said, "You're making a mistake." I didn't answer. I found that silence makes people say more than they intend to. He said 2 more sentences. Both were about what I owed him for his time, for his concern, for the inconvenience of driving out from the city. I listened to both. Then I closed the door. Vanessa came 20 minutes later. She knocked more softly than Marcus had. When I opened the door, she was standing in the hallway with her hands clasped in front of her, and she said, "Mr. Brennan, I think this is a mistake. We can work this out. I can help you manage the property. There are structures that would benefit everyone." She was using her professional voice, the one I had heard her use on the phone the day she first came to look at the house. It was a good voice, practiced. She believed it would work. I looked at her for a moment. I said, "No, you can't. The house is listed tomorrow. Goodbye." I closed the door a second time. Downstairs, I heard Marcus make a phone call. His voice carried up through the floor, not the words, just the tone, which was the tone of a man who has just discovered that a door he believed was open has been locked for some time. At 9 that morning, before I had cooked a single thing for dinner, I had called Frank Alderman, who had been my attorney since 1998. Frank had pulled the title records, confirmed that the property was in my name alone, unencumbered, with no joint tenancy or right of survivorship attached to any other party. Marcus had no claim, not a legal one. Helen found me in the kitchen at 11. I was drinking water by the window, watching the Douglas fir. She stood beside me and didn't say anything for a moment. Then she said, I told him that his father gave him everything, raised him, paid for school, kept this house standing through 35 winters, and that this is how he chose to answer it." She set her glass down. He didn't say a word. I looked at her. She had the expression of a woman who has been a nurse for 30 years and has learned to hold her face steady when the news is bad. I said, "He doesn't have an answer for that." She nodded once and went back upstairs. At 10 minutes past 11, my phone rang. Patricia Chen. I had worked with Patricia for 11 years. She had sold 2 investment properties for me in the 90s and had handled the estate transaction after Carol died. She did not call at 11 at night unless the information was worth calling for. She said, "Walter, I want you to know something. Since I posted the preliminary listing this evening, I've already had 3 calls from agents. 3 in under 2 hours." There was a pause. "Your house is worth more than either of us thought. The market moved while we weren't watching. I think we could have a full-price offer in 48 hours, maybe less." I looked out at the fir. The wind had dropped. The branches were still. I said, "Do it." She said she would have the paperwork ready by morning. I thanked her and set the phone on the counter. From upstairs, I could hear Marcus's voice again, low and insistent, talking to Vanessa. I didn't go up. I rinsed my glass, set it in the rack, and turned off the kitchen light. The house was quiet. It had always been good at quiet. Marcus called at 7:43 the next morning. I was at the kitchen table with my second cup of coffee, and the survey map I had pulled from the filing cabinet, the original, hand-drafted on linen paper, dated April 1989. I had drawn every line on it myself. I picked up on the second ring. He said, without preamble, that Helen had no legal standing in any of this. She wasn't family. She wasn't on the deed. Whatever she thought she knew about my intentions, she had no right to be involved in decisions about the property. I let him finish. Then I said, Helen is my wife. We were married 8 years ago. There's a certificate on file with Multnomah County, and her name is on my medical directive, my financial power of attorney, and my emergency contacts at Providence Medical Center, where, incidentally, she worked for 22 years. I paused. Is there something else? He said nothing for a moment. I could hear him breathing. Then he said he hadn't known about the marriage. I said, I know. He was still on the line. I could hear him deciding whether to say more. He didn't. I ended the call. I set the phone down and finished my coffee. The survey map lay flat on the table. I had drawn the property lines in ink, and after 35 years, they had not moved. Marcus came downstairs at 8:40. He found me in the kitchen. He was dressed jacket, the same one from dinner 2 nights ago, and he had the particular posture of a man who has spent the night rebuilding his confidence and believes he has succeeded. He stopped at the kitchen doorway and looked at me across the counter. You think you've done something, he said, but nobody's going to move this fast on a house like this. Patricia Chen isn't going to blow up a client relationship over one phone call from an old man at midnight. Nobody believes you. Dad, not really. I didn't answer right away. I've learned that silence makes people say things they wouldn't otherwise say. He said one more sentence, something about how I was confused, how this was grief-talking, how he was trying to protect me from myself. It was a well-constructed sentence. He'd had all night to build it. I picked up my phone from the table and opened the messages from Patricia. The one-time stamped 11:09 p.m. preliminary listing posted 3 agent inquiries already. The one from 7:52 a.m. full price offer received. Buyer wants 30-day close. Awaiting your instruction. I turned the phone and held it out to him across the counter. He took it. He read it. I watched his face the way I used to watch fresh concrete, looking for the moment the surface stops moving and you know what you have. The moment came. It started at his jaw. This isn't, he started. It's done. Marcus, I said. One sentence. I took the phone back, slid it into my shirt pocket, and walked past him toward the back door. I didn't look back. Behind me, I heard him say my name. Not Dad, just Walter. The way you say a name when you've run out of everything else. I stepped outside. The Douglas fir was catching the morning light. I stood there for a moment with my coffee and let the quiet settle. Helen was watching from the kitchen window. When I came back in, she handed me the survey map without a word. I sat down at the table and looked at the property lines I had drawn by hand 35 years ago. They had not moved. The survey map lay flat on the table. I had drawn the property lines in ink, and after 35 years, they had not moved. Helen came down around 8:15. She had heard the call, not the words, but the tone of it, and she stood in the doorway of the kitchen with her reading glasses pushed up on her head and looked at me. I told her what Marcus had said. She made a small sound, not quite a laugh, and poured herself coffee. We sat for a while without talking. That was one of the things I had always valued about Helen. She did not require conversation to fill a room. Around 9, I heard Marcus moving through the house. Not loudly, but methodically. He started in the hallway, then the study, then the small room off the back where I kept the filing boxes. Helen and I stayed in the kitchen. I did not go to ask what he was looking for. I already knew. He was looking for the deed, the title insurance policy, the trust documents, anything that might give him a handhold. I had moved all of it 3 weeks ago to my attorney's office on Southwest Broadway. The filing cabinet in the study now held tax returns from 2003 through 2011 and a collection of engineering trade journals I had kept meaning to donate. Helen watched me over the rim of her mug. After a moment, she smiled not broadly, Just the particular smile she had when she recognized something she'd expected to see. I did not smile back, but I understood it. Marcus came through the kitchen at 9:40, moving quickly, and set his phone on the counter near the toaster while he refilled his water glass. Vanessa called down from upstairs something about car keys, and he went out to the hallway to answer her. He did not come back for the phone. I noticed it when I stood to refill my own cup. It was face up, screen still lit. A text thread was open. The name at the top was someone called Darren K., and the most recent exchange was from 4 days ago. I did not go looking for it. It was simply there, the way a structural crack is simply there once you know where to look. I read the visible portion without touching the screen. Marcus had written, "Dad's getting old. Once we move in, we control everything. The house, the money, all of it. He won't even know what's happening. I give it 6 months before we have power of attorney over him." Darren K. had replied, "Smart. You sure he won't push back?" Marcus had written, "He's 67 and alone. What's he gonna do?" I set my coffee cup down carefully on the tile. Helen had gone still beside me. I took my own phone from my shirt pocket and photographed the screen 2 frames, close enough that the text was legible, far enough that the phone's case and the kitchen counter were visible as context. Then I walked to the window and forwarded both images to Frank Delgado at Delgado and Marsh. I had been his client for 11 years. The message I attached said, "See attached. Call when you can." Frank called back in 9 minutes. He said, "Walter, do you understand what this is?" I told him I had a reasonable idea. He said, "This is documented evidence of elder abuse planning. Premeditated." He put it in writing, with a timeline and a stated intent to obtain power of attorney by coercion or incapacitation. This doesn't just strengthen our position. This changes the nature of what we're filing. He asked if I had touched the phone. I told him I had not. He said to leave it exactly where it was and to send him the precise time I had taken the photographs. I did. Marcus came back through the kitchen 3 minutes later, picked up his phone without looking at me, and went upstairs. I watched him go. Helen stood at the sink, rinsing her mug, her back to the room. Patricia Chen called at 11:20. She said, "Walter, I need to tell you something. A man called my office this morning claiming to be your son. He said the property at Westbrook Lane was his, that you were acting without authority, and that I should halt the listing immediately." She paused. I told him the property is listed under your name only, that I hold a valid power of attorney document signed and notarized by you, and that any communication regarding the sale should be directed to your attorney of record. Another pause. Shorter. He hung up. I said, "Thank you, Patricia." She said, "The offer came in 40 minutes ago. Full asking price. They want a 30-day close." Her voice was level, but I had worked with her long enough to hear what was underneath it. "Walter, do you want me to accept?" I looked out the window at the fir. The morning light was on it now, coming through low and flat the way it did in October, turning the needles a color that had no good name. I said, "Yes." I set the phone down on the kitchen counter and stood there for a moment. The coffee maker had finished its cycle. I poured a cup and drank half of it standing at the sink, looking at the backyard. The fir tree was still catching the morning light. A robin had landed on the lower branch, the one I'd reinforced with a steel cable 18 years ago when the original wood began to split. The bird stayed for maybe 30 seconds, then left. I picked up the phone again and dialed David Chen. He answered on the second ring. He always answered on the second ring. In 11 years of working together, I had never once reached his voicemail during business hours. I'd asked him about that once, and he said that a lawyer who doesn't answer his phone isn't a lawyer, he's a filing cabinet. I said, "David, it's Walter." He said, "Walter, not a question, just the name. The way you say the name of someone you've been expecting to hear from." I said, "It's time to move to the next phase." There was no pause, no intake of breath, no shuffle of papers. He said, "Everything is ready. I've been waiting for your call." Then, after a moment, Patricia accepted the offer. Full asking price, 30-day close. Good, he said. That's cleaner than I expected. Sit down if you can. There are a few things I want to walk through with you, and I want to make sure you hear all of it. I sat down at the kitchen table, the same table where Marcus had sat 2 nights ago, with his hands folded in front of him like a man conducting a business meeting in someone else's office. I put my coffee cup on the same spot where his water glass had left a ring. I hadn't wiped it off. I'm not sure why. David said, "Let's start with the will. 6 months ago, you signed a new testamentary document in my office, witnessed by my paralegal, Renata Osei, and notarized by James Whitfield, who has been the notary of record for my firm for 22 years. That document supersedes the 2018 version entirely. Under the current will, all assets the Brennan Road property proceeds, the investment accounts, the retirement funds, everything transfer to Helen. Marcus receives nothing. Margaret receives a specific bequest as you instructed, separate from the main estate." I said, "Yes." "He doesn't know about the new will," David said. "He has no reason to. The 2018 version named him as a beneficiary. That's the version he's been operating on. Whatever calculations he's been running in his head, whatever timelines he's constructed, they're based on a document that no longer exists." I drank the rest of my coffee. It had gone lukewarm. I drank it anyway. David continued, "The power of attorney you executed in August gives Helen full legal authority to act on your behalf in all property and financial matters. It's durable. It doesn't lapse if you become incapacitated. It's already on file with the county recorder's office. Patricia has a certified copy. Your bank has a certified copy. When Marcus called Patricia this morning, he had no standing. He never did. But now there's a paper trail showing he attempted to interfere with a transaction he had no legal right to effect. He'll claim he was acting out of concern," I said. "He can claim whatever he likes," David said. "What he cannot claim is that he didn't know. He identified himself as your son and attempted to halt a sale of property that doesn't belong to him. That call was recorded. Patricia's office records all incoming calls. Her assistant, a young woman named Diane Tran, was on the line and will confirm the content of the conversation if necessary." I thought about Marcus sitting at the counter yesterday morning, eating the eggs Helen had made without asking whether anyone wanted eggs, talking about market trends in the Pearl District. He had the particular ease of a man who believes the ground beneath him is solid. I had watched him and said nothing. I had been saying nothing for 6 months, and every day of that silence had been a day of preparation. "The account transfers," I said. "Completed," David said. "The joint account with Helen now holds the primary liquid assets. Your individual accounts have been reduced to operating balances. There's nothing there worth pursuing, and more importantly, nothing there that can be frozen or contested during any legal challenge he might attempt to mount. He would need to demonstrate undue influence or diminished capacity to challenge the will. And I have documentation of your full competency from Dr. Elaine Park at OHSU, dated 4 months ago. A complete neurological and cognitive evaluation. She'll testify if it comes to that." I hadn't told Marcus about Dr. Park's evaluation. I hadn't told him about David's new filing. I hadn't told him about the joint account. I had sat at the same table where he'd made his announcement and eaten my dinner and said nothing, because there was nothing that needed to be said out loud. The work had already been done. It had been done in the quiet of early mornings, in David's office on the 4th floor of the building on Morrison Street, in Patricia's conference room with its view of the Willamette, in the records division of Multnomah County with a clerk named Brent who had stamped 4 separate documents without looking up from his desk. David said, "The house sale will close in 30 days. The proceeds will go directly to your account. Marcus has no legal claim to any of it." He paused. "I want to be precise about that. Not a reduced claim, not a contested claim, no claim, nothing." "And the other matter," I said, "the evidence of his elder abuse planning will be submitted to the district attorney's office. I've already spoken with an investigator there, a woman named Carol Reyes, who handles financial exploitation cases. She's reviewed the documentation, the text messages your daughter Margaret forwarded, the emails, the conversation you recorded in the kitchen 2 nights ago. She said the pattern is consistent with what their office prosecutes." I looked at the ring on the table where Marcus's water glass had been. David said, "She'll make the formal determination about charges, but she wanted me to tell you that what you've documented is thorough." Her word was thorough. "Will he be charged?" I said. David was quiet for a moment. Not the quiet of someone who doesn't know the answer, but the quiet of someone who is choosing how to give it. Possibly attempted elder financial abuse under Oregon statute, fraud, conspiracy. If the evidence supports a coordinated plan with Vanessa, those are serious charges. Walter, his attorney, will negotiate. There may be a plea. There may not be charges at all if the DA decides the evidence is better used in civil proceedings. He paused again. But at minimum, he will lose access to any inheritance. There is nothing left for him to inherit. And his real estate license, the Oregon Real Estate Agency, has a conduct review process. The fraud investigation alone is sufficient to trigger a review. Given what's in those text messages, I would be surprised if he holds that license 18 months from now. I said, "Good." The word came out flat and quiet, the way a door closes when you pull it all the way shut instead of letting it swing. David said, "There's one more thing." I waited. "Your daughter Margaret called me yesterday. She wanted to know if you were all right." He let that sit for a moment. I told her everything. The will, the power of attorney, the DA referral, all of it. I hadn't asked him to call Margaret. I hadn't needed to. Margaret had called him herself, which told me everything I needed to know about where she stood. David said, "She asked me to tell you something." Another pause, shorter. "She said to tell you she's proud of you." The kitchen was very quiet. Outside, the wind had picked up slightly, and I could hear the fur moving, not the creak of wood under stress, but the soft layered sound of needles shifting against each other, the sound that Tree had made for 35 years outside the window of the room where Carol and I used to have our morning coffee. I said, "Tell her I said thank you." David said he would. Then he said, "Walter, I want you to know something. In 30 years of practice, I have had clients come to me after the fact, after the will has been contested, after the account has been drained, after the house has already changed hands under circumstances that took 3 years and significant legal fees to untangle. What you did the way you did it, I don't see it often." He stopped. "I'm glad you called me when you did." I said, "You did the work, David." "We both did," he said. After I hung up, I sat at the table for a while. The coffee cup was empty. I didn't get up to refill it. I looked at the water ring Marcus had left on the wood, the pale circle that his glass had pressed into the surface over the course of a dinner he hadn't eaten, and a conversation he had believed was going entirely his way. I thought about the house on Brennan Road, the drawings I had made at this same table 35 years ago, the site surveys, the soil tests, the afternoon I had driven out to the lot with Carol, and we had stood in the middle of what was then an empty field, and she had pointed to where she wanted the kitchen window, and I had told her I could make that work. I had made it work. I had made a great many things work over the years, mostly by understanding that the time to prepare is before the problem arrives, not after. The robin was back on the fir branch, or a different robin, I couldn't tell. It sat there for a moment, then flew off toward the back fence. I got up, rinsed the coffee cup, and set it in the rack to dry. That night, I slept without interruption for the first time in 2 weeks. Helen was beside me, and at some point in the dark, she reached over and found my hand. I didn't say anything. I closed my fingers around hers and held on. She knew. She had known since the moment I came back upstairs from the storage room, since the moment I had set the phone face down on the nightstand and said nothing at all. There are things you don't need to explain to someone who has been paying attention for 31 years. I was awake before 5. The bedroom was still dark at the edges, the first gray light just beginning at the curtain sim. I got up carefully so as not to wake Helen, walked to the window, and looked out at the backyard. The oak I had planted the spring Margaret was born was 40 feet tall now. The stone path I had laid by hand, every flagstone leveled with a 4-foot torpedo level. Carol, standing at the kitchen window, calling out adjustments, ran from the back steps to the garden bed along the fence line. I looked at it for what I knew was the last time from this window. Not with grief. Exactly. More the way you look at a finished drawing before you roll it up and hand it over, knowing the work is complete, knowing it was done right. I went downstairs and started the coffee. Helen came in while it was still brewing. She didn't say good morning. She sat down at the table and folded her hands around her mug and looked at me. And that was enough. My phone buzzed on the counter. A message from Patricia Chen. The listing is live. We already have 5 offers. The highest is 15% above asking. Closing can happen in 36 hours if you want. I read it twice. I typed back, accept the highest offer. Close in 36 hours. 17 seconds later, she replied, done. The phone rang. Marcus. I watched his name on the screen through 3 full rings. Helen watched me watch it. I pressed the side button and set the phone face down on the counter. She looked at me. It's done now, I said. We just wait. She nodded once and lifted her coffee. Outside, the oak was catching the first light. 35 years of mornings in this kitchen, and I had never once taken that tree for granted. Patricia called at 9:47 the next morning. I was in the kitchen, finishing the last of the coffee I'd made at 6. Helen was at the table with her crossword, the same one she'd been working on for 3 days. Congratulations, Patricia said. The house sold for $2.1 million. That's $450,000 above asking. The money will be in your account by tomorrow morning. I set the mug down on the counter. Outside, the oak was doing what it always did, holding still while everything else moved. Thank you, Patricia. I won't forget this. She was quiet for a moment. Then, you prepared well, Walter. I'm just the instrument. She said it the way people say things they mean, without decoration. I told her I'd be in touch, and we hung up. Helen looked up from her crossword. I told her the number. She wrote it down on the corner of the newspaper, looked at it, and went back to 4 across. That was enough. Marcus called 11 times between 9 and noon. I know because I counted. The way I used to count ceiling tiles in meetings when someone was saying something I already knew, I let each call go. The voicemails stacked up. I didn't listen to them. What arrived in text was enough. Dad, please. We can work this out. I didn't mean it. Please don't sell the house. Please. 3 pleases in 4 sentences. I read it once, the way I used to read structural assessments looking for the single line that told you everything, and then I deleted it. Not out of anger. I want to be precise about that. Out of the same clarity you feel when you finished a calculation and the numbers hold. Margaret called at 12:30. She was on her lunch break. I could hear the hospital behind her, the particular background noise of a place where people are trying very hard. Dad, she said, I heard what Marcus did. I'm so sorry. I'm ashamed of him. It's not your fault, Margaret. You did the right thing by telling David. Thank you. I meant that. Margaret had called my attorney 3 weeks earlier after she'd found something on Marcus's laptop during a visit, a folder of documents, property transfer drafts, notes about timelines and legal vulnerabilities. She hadn't told Marcus she'd seen it. She'd called David instead. She was 33 years old, and she'd made the harder choice without being asked. Where will you go now? She asked. Helen and I will figure it out, I said. Don't worry about us. She said she loved me. I told her I loved her too. The hospital noise continued behind her, and then the call ended. Carol Whitfield called at 2. She'd lived next door for 20 years, the same 20 years she'd watched my driveway, told me when the gutters needed cleaning, brought food after Carol died. The other Carol, my Carol, I still thought of them that way in my head, and I'd long since stopped trying to untangle it. Walter, I heard you sold the house. Is everything okay? Yes, I said. Everything is fine. It was time to move on. A pause. I'm sorry to see you go. You were a good neighbor. Thank you, I said. You were too. That was the whole conversation. It was enough. David Okafor called at 3:15. He was my attorney of 14 years, and he used the same voice for good news and bad news, which I had always respected. The district attorney's office is opening an investigation into Marcus's conduct, he said. The documentation of elder financial abuse planning is substantial. The text chains, the transfer drafts, the loan application he filed in March using the Brennan Road property as collateral for an asset he didn't own. His brokerage has already been notified. They're conducting their own internal review. His license will likely be suspended pending the outcome of both investigations. I wrote down the relevant points on the notepad I kept by the phone, not because I needed to remember them, because I had always written things down. "How long?" I asked. "The DA's timeline is 6 to 9 months for a formal charge. The license suspension could happen within 30 days. He paused. "Walter, I want you to know this outcome is because of what you put in place. The documentation you started keeping in February, the recorded conversations, the loan application that Patricia flagged when Marcus approached her firm independently last month without telling you. You built this. I just filed it." I thanked him, and we hung up. I sat with that for a moment. February. That was when I'd started keeping the notepad by the phone, when I'd started saving every text, when I'd asked Patricia to flag anything unusual. 4 months before Marcus sat at my dining room table and announced that my house was his now. 4 months of quiet preparation, invisible to everyone except Helen and David and Patricia, the 3 people I trusted to hold what I knew without acting on it before the time was right. The time had been right. What happened to Vanessa, I learned from Margaret, secondhand. 2 days later, Marcus had tried to reach her the morning after the sale closed. She had already moved her things out of the apartment they'd shared. Her message to him, which Margaret read aloud over the phone with a flatness that told me she found it neither surprising nor satisfying. "I'm done with you. Marcus, I thought you had potential. Turns out you just have delusion." Margaret said Marcus had gone very pale when he read it. I didn't ask how she knew that. Some things you don't need to verify. The bank called Marcus on a Thursday. He had taken out a bridge loan in March, $240,000, secured against the anticipated transfer of the Brennan Road property. The loan officer, a man named Gerald Fitch, who had later provided a sworn statement to David's office, had flagged the application at the time as unusual but technically permissible given the documentation Marcus had submitted, documentation that included a letter, later determined to be fraudulent, suggesting the property transfer was already in process. When the sale closed and Marcus's name appeared nowhere in the transaction, the collateral evaporated. The bank moved immediately. By the end of the month, Marcus had filed for bankruptcy protection. His brokerage suspended his license on day 28. The week before we left, I walked through the house once, not slowly, not ceremonially. I checked the foundation joints in the basement the way I had every spring for 35 years, not because anything would need fixing, but because it was the habit of a man who built things and understood that what you build requires attention. The joints were solid. They would hold for whoever came next. Helen and I left on a Tuesday morning. She had packed what mattered. I had packed less than she expected and more than I needed. The moving truck had come the day before. The house was empty in the way that houses become empty when the objects are gone and what remains is only the shape of the years, the worn patch of hardwood by the back door, the pencil marks on the kitchen door frame where I'd measured Marcus and Margaret every birthday until they were too tall to measure, the specific quality of light in the upstairs hallway at 8 in the morning that I had never been able to describe to anyone and had stopped trying. I didn't look back when we walked to the car. Helen did. I let her. We drove south. Helen held my hand on the console between us, not tightly, just present. Somewhere past Eugene, she asked if I was sad. I thought about it the way I thought about structural questions, not quickly, but completely. "I'm not sad," I said. "I'm at peace. I did what I needed to do." She was quiet for a moment. "I know," she said, "and I'm proud of you." We didn't talk much after that. The road was long and the radio was low and the coffee in the thermos stayed warm until Medford. We were not there because I was old and needed to be managed. We were not there because Marcus had driven us out. We were there because Helen wanted to be near the water, and because I had spent 35 years building a house that was worth $2.1 million, and because the money was in my account, and because I chose this. The distinction mattered to me. It still does. 5 months after we moved in, My phone rang on a Wednesday afternoon. I was on the back porch with a cup of coffee, watching a pelican work the water line with the methodical patience of something that has been doing this for a very long time. The number was a corrections facility outside Portland. Marcus, I knew before I answered. I let it ring twice, then I picked up. He said my name. He said he was sorry. He said he hadn't understood what he was doing. Not really, not the full shape of it. He said he thought about the house. He said he thought about the pencil marks on the door frame. He said he was sorry again. I listened. I let him finish. There was a long pause on his end, the kind that waits for something, absolution, argument, the sound of a door left open. I said, "You built nothing, Marcus. You only ever tried to take what someone else built." Then I pressed the red button and set the phone on the armrest. The pelican made another pass. It found what it was looking for. The water was the same color it had been the day before and would be the day after, which was the thing I was still getting used to, the way the ocean kept its own schedule and required nothing from me. Helen came out with her own coffee and sat in the chair beside me. She didn't ask who had called. She looked at the water. After a while, I said, "Do you know what the best part is, Helen?" She looked at me. "What?" "No one can take this away from me. Not anymore. It's just us. And that's enough." She smiled, the particular smile she reserved for things she had known for a long time that I was only now saying out loud. She leaned her head against my shoulder. I put my arm around her. The pelican banked south and disappeared. The water kept moving. I drank my coffee. If you've ever sat beside someone you trust, watching something that asks nothing of you, and felt for the first time in years that what you have left is exactly enough, then you already understand why this story had to end the way it did. Not with a verdict, not with an apology accepted, just two people and the water and the particular quiet that comes after a very long time of noise. If these stories find something true in you, I'll keep telling them.